Hello, everyone. So welcome to this table topic on accelerating secure innovation with GitHub and Azure. So just some quick introduction of ourselves. So my name is David Okeode. So I'm the EMEA Azure CTO at Palo Alto Networks, which is a large Microsoft partner. I'm very much involved in the Azure security community. So I host an Azure meetup group, which is called Azure Cloud Security Meetup, very creative name. So if you go on meetup.com and you search for that name, you're going to find the meetup group. So, and as you can tell, I don't like doing exams at all. So I'm not a fan of exam, got a few certifications. So I do have some amazing people with me also today, so I'll let them introduce themselves.
Thanks a million, David. Appreciate that. Hi, my name is Matthew Brown. I'm a cybersecurity solutions architect for a Microsoft Gold partner in Ireland named NTES. As you can see, I'm the opposite to David. I love exams, love putting myself through the paces. My main focus areas are cybersecurity and Azure. So that's what I've been focusing on the last few years. I think Alan is next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alan Canaan. I'm Azure MVP and Microsoft Certified Trainer from Dublin, Ireland. IT professional for 20 years or so. Background in infrastructure. My background is in infrastructure, so I'm mostly working with Microsoft partners because I work for a cloud aggregator in Ireland. So working with Microsoft partners on helping them on their journey into the cloud, into Azure, and with a focus now on DevSecOps and developing their business practices around that.
Awesome. So thanks very much for joining us on today's table topic. So also, I've authored 2 books on Azure security. So one, Pen Testing Azure for Ethical Hackers, and another one, Microsoft Azure Security Technology. So both of them are available on Amazon. Quick information on what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to introduce the conversation that we're going to be having. We'll talk about code to cloud risks. We'll talk about scaling security with DevOps. And then Alan, Matt, and myself, we're going to have some discussions. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to ask your questions at that point. We also have Mike Weaver at the back that's helping us. So Mike has a lovely blog, so madmike.net, check it out. So Mike will also be helping us in terms of moderating the room. If you have any questions, just raise your hand and the mics will be passed to you. And also, if you're online, feel free to ask your questions in the chat window and Mike will pass those to us and then we're going to address the questions. So let's get started. So many organizations, in terms of how they roll out software today, so they follow the DevOps approach. So lovely definition of DevOps by Donovan Brown many years ago. So union of people, process, and product. So there's a people aspect to DevOps. It's a cultural aspect to DevOps. There is a process aspect to DevOps. And there is a product aspect to DevOps. At the end of the day, the objective is to deliver technology value to end users. So, and we have the 5 key pillars that makes up what we call DevOps. So you have the pillar of agile planning, version control, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous monitoring. And if you have a look at what's been going on in the industry, there's a recent survey that came out from Google. A lot of organizations that are adopting DevOps, they're really good at implementing these 5 core practices. But what that ends up creating for the security team, it should get something like this, which is the DevOps team are moving at a very rapid pace that security are finding it difficult to keep up with. So, and that's the situation for many organizations today. So I know I work with lots of companies that this is their current situation. So what we need to do is we need to implement security on a continuous basis. So the only way for security to work is if security is embedded into every of those other phases, into agile planning, version control, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and also continuous monitoring and feedback. So here's just some stats for you in terms of what we've been seeing lately. So there was a study that was done by Veracode, and one of the things that they saw was that about 93% of applications have at least one security flaw. And again, that makes sense. The more code we write, the more flaws we're actually creating, the more risks that we are creating. And they had a look at tons of code repository, and about 90% of those code repositories are using open source dependencies. So what that means is that more developers are leveraging open source dependencies to be able to deliver value quicker, right? It makes sense to reuse code, not writing everything all the time. And talking about open source library usage, another very interesting study is the percentage of code that people are writing. What's the percentage that they're writing in-house? What's the percentage of just reusing other people's code? And if you have a look at the result from the study, a lot of Java code repositories that they had a look at, about 97% of the code that they found were actually dependencies. Only 3% were written natively, like in-house. And but .NET, that's roughly around 60%. So that's shot up around .NET 5 release. So that went up rapidly. And for JavaScript and Python, that's roughly around 50% each. About 50% of the code written in-house, about 50% are open source dependencies. And before I go too further ahead, just to get a feel of who we have in the room. So how many people are in the room that you consider yourself to be an IT professional? If you just raise your hand, an IT pro? Awesome, okay. How many people consider yourself to be a developer in the room? Yeah, we have a few spies, okay? And how many people consider yourself to be a security person, someone, cybersecurity person? Okay, yeah, we have a few of my people, yeah, good. Awesome, okay. So thanks very much for that. So just to get a feel of those that are in the room. But it's the same thing. So for the IT pros, when we talk about infrastructure as code, adopting those templates, Terraform template, ARM template, Bicep templates. At Palo Alto Networks, we actually did a research. Unit 42 team did a research on this. And about 64% of templates that people are downloading from GitHub repositories and reusing to create their environment have at least one eye or critical misconfiguration. About 99% of Elm charts that people are downloading and using from code repositories, and that's really massive. When we started looking at that number, we're expecting it to be high, not that high. And about 91% of container images have at least one critical or high severity vulnerability. So we're talking about earlier, we need to get better at doing security continuously. And if you look at the process of development, committing code to the code repository, pushing the code to one of the main branches, and then that triggers up a process of code review. You have your code merge, and then you do your QA testing, and you do your shipping and your deployment. If you look at the number of hours or the time that teams are spending across all these stages, it takes days to when you get to like the QA, the shipping and deployment stages, but it only takes hours for the rest. And if you look at the cost to fix security issues in terms of switching your context from what you're doing to something else, if it's discovered much more later, it actually costs more to fix the issues if you wait up till the end. And the whole point of that is that security in a continuous delivery world is best addressed at the earlier stages. What you want to ideally get to is where you're addressing about 70% or 80% of security issues before they get to production, because after it gets past that, it becomes much more difficult to be able to manage. So I'll hand over to Alan to talk more about how we can actually do that.
Yeah, I just want to talk for a minute about the team effort that's involved in DevSecOps. I know we've mostly got IT pros in the room here, so same as myself. So IT pros, I suppose, traditionally work on the infrastructure. Developers are not really expected to be network security experts. So I do a lot of networking and network design with partners. The developers wouldn't be so much involved in designing those networks. They wouldn't be involved in setting up DDoS policies and routing and firewall policies. That's for the IT pros to do. But equally, the IT pros wouldn't have the skills to analyze code. That's not in their wheelhouse at all. And more nowadays, we're seeing a move away from purely infrastructure or infrastructure as a service. It's becoming more involving PaaS services and into a software as a service model. So it's a combination of using some infrastructure and some development skills. So DevSecOps brings these teams together. If you remember what David said, it's mostly about people and process. Yes, there's tools there, that's important as well, but it's bringing those different teams and those different skill sets together and working as a team. And then it's improving. If you remember, it's a continuous cycle. So CI/CD is continuous integration, continuous development. It's not just a single project. You are constantly working as a team to develop that product and make the changes as it goes on. And by collaborating together, using the tools that are available, making use of automation, shifting left, moving security to the start of the planning of the development lifecycle, the same with testing. By doing that early, it's much more efficient for both teams to achieve that. And I just want to finally mention training. Training, especially with security, is crucial because there's constantly new threats, new vulnerabilities being released out there. So keeping that skill set up to date is hugely important for both infrastructure people and for developers.
Yeah, and to buttress what Alan just said now, the importance of training. So there was actually, again, another report. So I love data and I love to read a lot of reports around what's going on in the industry. There was a report of organizations that train their infrastructure and development teams on security, and the time to fix security issues increased by about 60%. Versus organizations that did not do that training. So it's very, very important. I think you wanted to...
Yeah, so one of the biggest things I've seen over the last 2 years in training, especially with the likes of Microsoft certification, is the shift from, I suppose, product-based training to the likes of fundamentals, associated, and expert level. So what Microsoft have done is they've moved everything over into role-based training, so that, like, if you're working on the likes of Office 365, you have your associate level exams that you can do and learn further about that. One of the biggest things in training in terms of cybersecurity and DevOps is looking at the likes of the SC 100, 2, 3, 4, and 5 exams. They kind of go into all the different areas of cybersecurity, and Microsoft has great learning paths done out for that. What's even better is the fact that as someone, if you start off from the ground and work your way up the ladder, you can really see a benefit to both your own training plan and your career advancement. Microsoft have clearly shown that. Recent Pearson VUE study showed that over 67% of professionals got more confident in what they were actually doing versus someone who hasn't actually sat any training. So you're going to find your job, whether you're doing Office 365 administration, you're working on DevOps pipelines, you're doing cybersecurity in a SOC, or you're looking at the likes of Azure AVD specialty exams, where you want to kind of really understand what AVD is about, how to implement it properly, adding your security aspect into that. Why is it important to have your front door, your WAF, your your NSG groups, all that kind of stuff. So what that training does is you learn about it, you bring it into your everyday career, and then on top of that, you can help others and train them in that certification. And as part as being an MVP, that's something I've done over the last 2-3 years. I've tried to do that remotely with people. So it's just, training is important. It's free to renew it, and you can always add more skills to your belt, and you'll see that as your career moves on.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Okay, so just to round up the presentation side of things. So if you have a look, at least from my own experience, what I've seen in terms of organizations that have successfully adopted this approach to security, continued security embedded into every phase of the DevOps lifecycle. So just some points for you here. You have to go in with the mindset that security has to be frictionless, right? You can't go in with the approach of, I'm going to force the developers to change their way of doing things, right? If you talk to the developers in the room and you say to them, how many of you wake up every morning and you feel excited about closing security issues? They probably won't be excited about that. They're excited about coding. And whatever you're doing from a security perspective has to fit into that. It should not bring friction. So security must preserve developer productivity. It's something that we have to, as security people, I'm a security person myself, it's something we have to reorient ourselves to that. Developers bring a lot of value to the business. They're able to create these technology values that are used by the internal teams and that are used by the customers. And security must preserve developer productivity. It's about empowering developers beyond the ability to accelerate builds and deployment. So the analogy I like to use is we don't all have to be professional firefighters. However, it doesn't take much to really train someone to be able to use, an equipment to put out like a small fire. So that's what we're talking about here. Proactive feedback and enforcement is important. So we still have to have enforcement and guardrails implemented, leveraging things like Azure policy, but also making sure that people can get feedback in the tools that they are used to using, in the tools that they use daily, right? So they don't have to switch their context into another tool. And finally, comprehensive coverage. Going into this with a mindset of, I'm going to force you to use this product, I'm going to force you to use this, probably would not get the result that you're looking for. You have to be much more open to learn how they work and learn how to embed security into that flow. Okay, so let's get to, sorry, I almost forgot this part. So GitHub Advanced Security, which if you've had a look at the Ignite book of news, there was a lot of announcement around this. So GitHub Advanced Security has three main capabilities that we can begin to leverage for this sort of processes that we're talking about. So first one, code scanning. So it has a capability or a tool provided by GitHub and security expert called CodeQL that assesses about 11 languages and assesses code risks, and it traces the flow of data through code. You have secret scanning that has support for over 75 providers. So in case people are checking in secret into code, about 80% of breaches in recent times can be traced to exposed or stolen identity or stolen credentials. And finally, it has dependency review for the open source aspects that we talked about earlier to make sure that you're checking the open source dependencies that are being used by the teams. Okay, so let's get into some discussion points. So I'll ask the question to both Alan and Mike first, and then we'll also open it up to everyone that may have questions on what we've been talking about. So from your experience in the application of shifting security to the left, how much of this is a cultural or technology conversation?
From my point of view, it's definitely a combination of both, for sure. I would say it's more of a cultural shift, particularly I think for infrastructure people, because it's usually learning a new process of working. As we said before, DevOps is mostly about people and processes, so it's using the way developers have traditionally worked, and it's a change in mindset for infrastructure people. But it's very much, as I was saying before, working together as a team. It's very much a team effort. You're no longer, I suppose, in a way competing against one another. You very much have to bring those two skill sets together at the start. So it's more of a cultural shift, I think. Yes, the tools are there. There's lots of great automation on the technology side, but more of a cultural shift, I think.
I love what you said there. It's not about competing with each other. And that's one of the alignments that happens with DevSecOps, is that actually working out metrics where both teams are working together towards the same goal. It's one of the things that one needs to work out. So what's your thoughts around that, Matt?
Yeah, it's the same actually, David. A lot of places, what they're doing is they used to, everybody was doing one element, but now it's you're bringing it together. That's what DevOps is. Yeah. And instead of having one person focusing on maybe Kerberos or one person focusing on our back roads, you're actually bringing in a team of people to work together and complete projects to the end with a security focus on them. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely, it's a shift and a cultural move to bringing people together and doing it.
Yeah. And there was I think it's part of like the Azure DevOps course that you talked about. So part of the Azure DevOps course, I remember there's like part of the training that talks about a research that was done that cross-functional teams are actually more productive than just horizontal teams. So having vertical teams versus horizontal team structures.
Yeah, and a key component to that is the recent Microsoft the announcements to the partner training, which was the accreditations, and one of them is actually DevOps and one is security. So it's kind of handy to get those designations. You need experts in your organization to work together, and that's what it's all about. Yeah.
Awesome. So any question in the room from anyone or maybe online, maybe before we get into some other aspects?
I've got a couple online, but I'll start with one and then we'll go to the room and come back. Carnegie was asking, Matthew, while you're doing your DevOps section, are there any Microsoft Learning recommendations? I know you just mentioned some training to help partners, but is there anything really to help in that aspect, or perhaps anyone else on the panel?
Yeah, to be honest, I would, thanks, Mike. I'd go back to basics, especially if you're only kind of stepping into DevOps. Look at your foundational training. Where you're looking at is your AZ 900, which is really important. You need to learn the basics in Azure. Maybe your Power Platform Fundamentals certification, and then you would also, you'd move on to your associate level, which would be your Azure administrator, and then also look at doing your DP 100 exam, I think it's called, which is your DevOps associate. So, and then from there, spend a few years doing that and build up to your DevOps expert certification. And what you'll find is when you go through the process, you'll find your learning gets really solid and you understand it. And it's you're more so doing a rinse and repeat with it. So you're trying to, you're trying to get that out there and you're doing it every day. So in theory, you should be good at it after a few years. And it does take time. Rome wasn't built in a day. So yeah, take your time and learn it and enjoy it.
Nice.
Great, thank you. We do have a few more coming in. Why don't we go to the room for a few questions and come back to me in a minute.
So on that.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it's slightly off topic, so forgive me. From your industry awareness, what's the balance with regards to people and organizations adopting tools like GitHub versus Azure DevOps for that CI integration type capability? And have you got like a personal preference on what provides the best security options?
Yeah, it's very interesting because we were just having coffee this morning together and we're discussing that. So the stats that I actually heard from Microsoft is that I think about 80% of Microsoft internal projects still runs on Azure DevOps, and maybe the remaining 20% are sort of like running on GitHub, or they're deploying using GitHub. So, and I guess the approach is the approach that was used to describe it is like the cars, where you have the diesel car, the petrol cars, they're not going to go away in the next few years. But if you want the cool capabilities, like you may probably want to go to maybe the electric car, right? So sort of like similar, you want capabilities like GitHub Copilot, GitHub Code Spaces, and all those other advancements that Microsoft are bringing to the DevOps world. GitHub is probably the platform that you want to be on, right? However, what we're also beginning to see is that some of those capabilities seems to now be making their way gradually to Azure DevOps, like GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps that was announced this time. So I'm not sure if Matt or Alan has any thoughts about it.
I think myself and Alan and David, we were all saying that this morning, that it's a shift. People are trying to move to DevOps because it makes sense. There's a process, you follow it, you streamline it, but what we're finding is not every organization has the individuals with that experience. So you can bring on entry-level DevOps people, and they might have the experience of using Azure and doing everything through CLI that way, but they might not necessarily have the likes of the pipeline skills and all that to really go down the DevOps route. A lot of it's kind of targeted. A lot of the bigger organizations are doing it, not the smaller SMB markets. Like in Ireland, it'd be small SMBs, except for the likes of your Aircom, your Airgo. Joe Carlisle was speaking earlier, and he said the same. So it depends. It depends on the skill set in the organization.
And one of the limitations of the GitHub platform in the past is sort of that native integration with the Azure platform, which Azure DevOps has from its very foundation. However, Microsoft are really accelerating that. So at Microsoft Build this year, there was the OAuth 2 capabilities that was announced for authentication between GitHub platform and Azure. So you're going to see more of those. And essentially, it depends. You want to use the cool stuff, just land straight on GitHub platform. You're already using Azure DevOps. Some of those capabilities we brought down to you also.
I'll just quickly say, from my point of view, GitHub is clearly the future, and Microsoft obviously spent a lot of money acquiring GitHub. You can see where that's where the investment's going. As David mentioned, that's where the integration's coming. But even like the exam criteria for the AZ400 was very much focused on Azure DevOps. It's now more focused on GitHub. So I think that's probably the future. If you're starting out, that's where I'd put my energy. I think learning GitHub over Azure DevOps.
Nice. Thanks.
Great. Tuas has a question on how do you implement this in enterprise environments? Do you foresee putting a DevOps security expert into a dev team? Do you have a centralized security model? What about smaller firms where they may have problems getting these kinds of experts? How are you seeing this actually implemented?
So there's a whole lot of models that I've seen. I've seen like the cross-functional model of bringing the two together. I've seen people, for example, like there's a large manufacturer that I won't mention their name, that their model is sort of like if the team that built it runs it also and secures it. So they have a team that's made up of security people, developers, security people, they have SREs, and then they have like infrastructure people all in the same team working together on the same product. So there are different models. I think it depends on what really works for the organization. So for example, to implement the model that I just described, that requires ability to hire a lot of experts and bring those into those teams. Whereas if you're not able to do that, you could have some a team that sort of like provides services to like infrastructure team and provides services to the development team instead of bringing together that collaboration. So different models that you see.
Great. Some questions in the room?
Okay, I can go to the next discussion very quickly. Okay, so here's another discussion point. So is it important to shift infrastructure security to the left? And also, so for both of you, what does shifting security to the left look like from an infrastructure perspective? You both have very strong infrastructure background. What do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely important. For infrastructure, I normally start off with networks. I think that's integral to, certainly to infrastructure is integral, but even to most applications, you're always going to need connectivity. So a network design is very important. And nowadays, when we implement a zero trust policy, it makes sense to do that at the start, because trying to implement zero trust at the end is much more complicated. You end up doing a lot more redevelopment work. Ultimately, it's more expensive. So if you're going with zero trust, especially also if you have certain compliance requirements, so if you have very specific regulatory compliance policies that need to be implemented, that's where design needs to come in. So shifting the design of that to the left and implementing the security around that is important. And remember as well, we're not just shifting design and security, it's testing as well. So you need to make sure everything's tested as early in the process as possible, because it's just more efficient for all team members and more cost effective as well.
And from the testing perspective, shifting to the left brings tremendous value. So if you think about what Alan just described, you have a single template that you could potentially use to provision 5 environments. You have 5 misconfigurations in a single template, you provision 5 environments, you have 25 security issues to go fix. Addressing those, testing those earlier for misconfiguration and issues and addressing them quicker will save you a lot of time. I think we have a question in the room also. Yeah.
Just picking up on the infrastructure testing side. From your view, what do you think's a better approach? Using something like Golang or TerraTest or Pesta for testing your infrastructure within the pipeline to integrating unit testing, then looking at who would actually write them unit tests and how you define them security policies, or later in the pipeline using something like Terraform Cloud or Azure policies to validate what's being built?
Yeah, I've seen both approaches. Pester seems to be the one I hear most people using. They seem to prefer that. I think that's probably the best approach personally from my own experience. And as I said, from what I've heard in the industry, that's the one, that's the name I keep hearing mentioned. So I would probably take that approach personally anyway.
Yeah. My own thoughts around that is actually, I would like to keep it simple. So if anything, there's a tool that sort of like has a lot of these integrations already. Like for example, like the Microsoft Defender for DevOps that just came out, I know they have integration with something called the Template Analyzer. There are tools in addition to Pesta, like Chekhov also, which are open source. So there are some of the things. At the end of the day, I think you just look at what you need to assess in your pipelines. Pesta, very, very great framework, just like Chekhov or Template Analyzer also. I think we probably ran out of time now, I think. So again, thanks very much for joining us. If you want to carry on with the conversation, we're going to be around. Feel free to come have a chat with any of us. We'll be happy to do that. So thanks very much and see you next time.
Thanks, Malia.